All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Parthivi Das, C2HR's Executive Director, and I want to welcome you to today's HR Learning Series. We are able to offer free quality educational programs for our members thanks to the generous support of our 2025 sponsors. We sincerely appreciate your support. We invite you to join our next HR Learning Series, which focuses on building your company's AI training programs on April the 15th. Please check our website, c2hr.org, to register. Now, for today's HR Learning Series, features Hali Croner, President and CEO of the Croner Company and a longtime partner for C2HR. Today, Hali will share highlights from the recently released C2HR Compensation Surveys. We greatly appreciate her sharing her insight and expertise on pay trends and benchmarks. This webinar will be interactive, so we encourage you to post questions and comments in the Q&A box. Hali will answer those questions at the end of her presentation. SHRM has approved this webinar for 1 CE credit, and the credit code will be emailed to all participants after the event. Please note today's webinar is being recorded, so we also send the recording and the presentation to you after today's event. So now, Hali, I'll turn it over to you and let you start sharing the results.
Thank you, Parthivi, and thank you everybody who's here to learn today. I'm so excited to share what we have found, the highlights of what we found in our 2 compensation surveys that we do partner with C2HR on every year to look at compensation trends. The 2 surveys focus on I call the left and the right hand of the industry, which are the connectivity providers and the content developers. And I'll go through who those are in a minute. And I will just say that one of the exciting things that we've been watching over the past many years that we've been conducting the survey is the evolving landscape and what you need to do to find talent and to compensate them in it. Connectivity providers have been longtime participants and supporters of the survey, and it's focused on and the compensation study is focused on the jobs that are very specific to them. It's a highly consolidated industry, as many of you know, and we always say there are larger organizations and smaller organizations, but smaller in the connectivity providers is actually quite large. So we have a group of very large consolidated organizations that we have in a greater than 9 billion in revenue, with an average of 38.9 billion in revenue all over the US. And the smaller ones are still almost a $500 million on average. So we have a wonderful group of devoted participants who want to focus always on what is our sector doing for our sector specific jobs and what are the trends that we can find. The content developers have also been evolving in terms of who is in the survey. Over the years, we've had some very long-term participants that we would just classify just to make it easy to organize your thinking about who participates. We have cable networks. We have national broadcast networks, which are part of some of the same organizations, but they have a different set of jobs and practices that we cut out, that we pop out. And then we have all sorts of wonderful other media organizations who share many of the roles in the content developer space. And we also have streaming content providers in this group, such as Amazon. And so it's a wonderful group of those who focus on content and distributing their content. All of our participants are very active players from their side of the industry in the digital space. And if you want to take home one single trend that we've been seeing over the past several years, and what you'll see in today's presentation, is that the pressure of streaming, the need to stream, the need to meet our audiences, you and me, where we are, has really impacted this industry more than anything. So connectivity providers are all in the space of making sure that we can get to our content anywhere and get to them anywhere. And our content developers are also all in the streaming space. So you're all there. And so what was the participants that were some were streamers and some not, everybody is everything. And this is impacting talent and matches. So the changing landscape is this. The media industry is facing really important, big challenges to take everything that the media does and bring the message and bring the signal to where the audience is. And so what we this little graphic is meaningful to us because it's got a lot of different people running in a lot of different lanes, and we're trying to reach our people, and we're trying to reach our viewers in every way we can across a whole bunch of different lanes and a whole bunch of different places, and both traditional and new. So we made a quote here because we're always trying to give a feeling of what's impacting compensation and roles. And what we are finding is that with everybody in multiple spaces, competition is fierce, as this quote says, that the new technologies are constantly changing the game, and that our businesses and portfolios are in flux as we try to get to consumer engagement, which is everywhere. So that has been the new challenge, not only in the media industry, but I would say everywhere. And this is really impacting all sorts of things. We try to track the evolution from much more traditional channels and networks to digital networks. And what we have found from 2020 all the way up till our most recent research is that digital content, which is green in this chart, has a tremendous number of Golden Globe nominations. And we think that's important because that's where people are going to see the content. So if you look here, you'll see the dark blue is national broadcast, the networks, the gray are premium channels of pay-per-view. Cable is free to air, and digital is our SVOD, SVOD and AVOD. And you can see that our premium channels have always done very well. They've had a high levels of accolades. Our cable has had some, and our digital has been thriving. So not only are we getting our content in a lot of different places, but the digital content that we're seeing is getting tremendous accolades. That might also be because we're consuming it there too. And to be able to compete in a fragmented world, individual organizations are having a hard time just making it on their own. And so what we've been seeing are more and more mergers and acquisitions rather than, and a few spins, what we'll talk about, to be able to compete for content and viewers and to consolidate it the way that people used to be consolidated. So between 2023 and 2025, the industry has been impacted by all sorts of mergers and combinations and acquisitions, as you can see here. And so when that happens as C2HR, we have two companies becoming one, we have two board members becoming one, we have different colleagues ending up working together, and we have lots of questions about how to pay the jobs that are still there or the jobs that are doubling up. The other thing that we're seeing when we're not seeing consolidation is that we're seeing a few spins, and to rationalize being able to get on the streaming versus our traditional channels. So many of you know that Comcast has created a spin co with a lot of its called traditional cable networks because they have affiliated distribution with the cable operators, the connectivity providers, and then there are those that are premium brands that can be streamed. And then knowing that needing to get to the digital space is so important, we all know we've read about the collective write-downs around the cable networks because really they're going into a space of digital. So lots of flux. We're so impressed and fascinated by the business decisions that your leaders are making. And again, compensation follows the organization design, and there's a lot of change. On top of your industry needing to rush to streaming and also reconfigure to stay competitive with the viewers, we've also had not only industry pressures but economic pressures. So we had, COVID rattled our world. Thank goodness the COVID years, from a compensation perspective, are starting and revenue and other kinds of perspective are evening out. But what we have found is that we're seeing a dampening on compensation. So not only is the world getting crazy, but compensation is cooling. And what we're showing here, we love to look at this, is the connectivity providers are on the left and the content developers are on the right. And we have the last 5 years. And what we look at is how many positions in our surveys had more than 5% on average growth. In other words, when on average for the companies that participate in year over year, how much are paying more than 5% from last year of the role that they reported. And what we found was 20 for connectivity providers, we had a big up, it was starting to cool until after COVID in 2020. We had fewer that were high growth jobs into 2022. We popped up in 2023 with high growth jobs, and we're back down in our most recent survey with less high growth jobs. And you can see an even more clear trend line in content developers where we had 25% growing with high growth jobs in 2020, which was the year of COVID. Then we had craziness, ad sales fell through the roof, through the floor. And then we popped back up with high growth because there was pent up demand. And now high growth is cooling. So I think if you take away trends right now, we have a higgledy-piggledy world and cooling compensation. I'd like to show you that in another way that we found about compensation trends. This is our connectivity providers again. And what we look at is by organization grouping, management, salaried, and hourly. I'd like you to focus on the blue base salary. We look at how much year over year for the same roles that base salary changed. And in management, we saw very limited growth in salaries. We saw more growth in total cash compensation and total direct. Gray is actual total cash, and green is total direct. And we saw for salaried a more moderate 3% than 4.4. For hourly, we saw slower growth overall as well. We saw 2.6. What these orange bars are, is how much growth we had last year. So we had higher growth for management, higher growth in salaried and hourly last year. So again, we saw slower growth in our connectivity providers. You also saw that with we saw a lower percentage of hot growth. So very, very stable. And so as you're thinking about the next year, you're working with employees with a slower growth for each job. When we do look at the hot jobs, and that is jobs that grew more on average than the standard growth, we saw them in construction. We think that might be supply and demand. We saw that in marketing because you're going to have to reach, get even more, digital and different types of skills in marketing to reach your customers. And we did see a growth in customer care technical support. So these are the areas where we saw higher hot jobs in the area. So what it means to us is when times get rougher, people invest in infrastructure and they invest in reaching out to their clients and to their customers, and then making sure that the customers feel really good about sticking with the business. So important areas where skill sets are growing and there needs to be a higher pay movement. The other thing that we've been watching over the years is that that connectivity providers also, because of the digital movement, have really moved into the software and applications space to deliver all that they deliver to us. And so this is not new information, but when we look at the investment in software engineering, when we look at the differential of pay across our senior individual contributors, these are our senior coders versus our journey, which is our kind of core individual contributors. Software engineering are roles that are gaining paid in the market 30 to 42% more than non-technical jobs because of the investment that our connectivity providers are paying, they need to compete with technology companies. So big investment in software engineering, that's not new, but that is to be able to deliver our product to us. And that's important when thinking about competitive pay. The other thing that we've seen, and we think this is finally got to where people wanted it to be, and then it might be flattening out, is that we've watched over the years, this is cumulative growth from 22, 23, 24 of salaries across our installation service, one of our biggest highly populated tech jobs. And you can see that this is the entry. So we're going from the lead to the entry. And you'll see that there was a lot of movement to bring our entry level jobs over the past 3 years up to a certain level. And I think that also had to do with high levels of inflation. And then we've seen growth over the past, more similar for our normal and our senior and our lead jobs, but we've seen very strong growth over the 3 years to level out and grow pay in these areas. The other thing that we like to look at trends because we think it's very indicative because people are being paid for roles and you're trying to stay competitive and you're trying to stay competitive with the markets that you need for the roles. And we're also got pay transparency and we need to pay for the job. The more variable parts of pay are bonus. So what we like to look at in each of our surveys is how did bonuses look this year compared to previous years? How well were they funded? So in our last survey, and we asked you to give us, bonuses funded in 2024. Now we're asking you in 2025. But in 2024, we looked at, this is the green bar. We said, if you have a pool, how much greater or less than that pool was funded to pay out bonuses? And what we found really interestingly was that the executive pool paid about at target because it said, look, if we just funded $1 million or I'm going to do $100 pool. We funded it at 102 and we distributed it out to executives. So I would say over the past 3 years, there's been less variation in executive bonuses. It's been around target. When we get to middle management, there was a great payout in 2022 as a percent. So you were funding your bonus pools at 16% greater, 17% greater, 14% greater than target. But then the next year for 2023, not as good of a year, and bonus pools were less than target, except for our hourly folks. Then finally, this year, they're much more close to target, a little bit above for management, just a little bit below for salaried, a little bit less for hourly. Hourly tends to not get as many bonuses, so even a small change would be less. But that's been the trend. The bonuses were meh. They were meh. The other thing that's interesting to those of you who like to do the analytics is we say, well, what's really driving these bars? And so we also show by year the distribution, what's making something below or at or above target. So that's for your reference. So bonuses were not so good in 2024, and that's important to know as well. Then we move over to the content developers who also are challenged to find ways to make money off of their streaming and our audiences are getting fragmented. So how are they doing? Well, our content developers had pretty good, let's call it steady but moderate growth in salaries. So blue is base salary. Our executives saw a little bit more, 4.1. But if you look across middle management, professionals, and operating and support roles, we're seeing about a 3, low 3. And what you'll see is that the previous year, it grew a little bit more. So again, a little bit of cooling in how fast pay was growing because the orange bars from last year are higher than they were than this year's growth. So again, moderate growth in salaries, moderate growth in bonuses and total and long-term incentives, but executives have more dynamic growth. Content developers had a wide range of hot jobs. And so we drew a line because we see we drew 2 lines. We see in the middle more technical operations, and we then have more of deal making and communications at the top. And then we have audience and market research, which is becoming, again, so critical in understanding where to reach us where we are because audiences, again, are fragmented and we need audience and market researchers who could really understand and find what will address and keep the audiences. So here's where we saw a lot. You can see some of the percent year-over-year changes that were quite substantial, particularly in broadcast operations. We do know that this was primarily for our cable programmers here, but we've had these are some areas where there are important investments in for content developers. So that was really, really interesting. The other thing we found in content developers, because there's been the industry has been impacted, and there have been people who left roles. There have been people during mergers and acquisitions who have had to leave roles. Of course, there's always hiring too, but there's been, some job loss and turnover. One of the things that we found is that we are finding in the content developer survey that the average tenure of the people matched into roles is lower. And so when we saw the more moderate growth in the survey, it may also be because we have more lower, we have more entry level jobs and or people, the more senior people are leaving. So that we did see growth, but we saw 59% of our incumbents across the company, they had less tenure across all their levels. And on average, we're seeing if you could look up here, the mean change in tenure, on average, we're seeing about a 1 year less of tenure across all levels, a little bit less for C level, but really this is a percent, this is 0.9 of a year, about 1 year less. A little operating individual contributor, we didn't see very much decrease, but when we saw the decrease, it was really about 1 year. So we're seeing slightly newer populations in the content developers survey, which we think might also be in the mix of things that you have to think about. We also wanted to look at bonuses the same way we did for connectivity providers. And again, our 2024 year was not so good. So while our executives seemed to be funded at target, that most of the pools were funded below target and bonuses were paid at levels below target. And we again showed the distribution that, we had 44% of our participants below target, 44 at, and then 13% above, really driving these below target. And then you'll see what a great year bonuses were in 2022. So when I think that it's really helpful to look at the variability of bonuses because it's more of an indicator of how the companies are doing. So again, both sides of the industry are coming off of moderate growth and not so great bonuses, not exciting bonuses as before. The things that we also want to remind you about being in this sector, in this segment, are just the kinds of bonus plans that are out there and when you're competitive and when you're not, about what you offer. Bonuses are very broad-based across this industry. What we're talking about here are bonus plans, and you'll see 91% of our connectivity providers offer them, as do 89%. Not 100% of the world offers bonuses. Some of our newer entrants don't necessarily use bonus. They use other compensation elements, but a broad range of this participants do. And for both, and even more so for connectivity providers, there's a very broad-based participation. 70% of our participants offer bonuses all the way down to support. Content developers, really, more of the non-exempt, only half offer to non-exempt and support, but they'll go from individual contributors and up. So bonus is quite prevalent. When we get into long-term incentives, this is where it gets really interesting. This is stock, RSUs, stock options, long-term cash plans. The C2HR surveys, the connectivity providers and content developers, slightly fewer, but it's still broad-based, will offer long-term incentives. You'll see in connectivity providers, it goes down primarily through the director levels. I will tell you that connectivity providers, their definition of director is a broader, bigger job generally than in the content developers. So I would say that vice presidents, the scope of vice presidents in content developers often match the scope of directors. So you just see big leadership in both of this starting to participate in long-term, and then a quick limiting of participation at lower levels. So managers in 50% and 50% at directors and managers. Because you're all working in the streaming space, and because everybody has a streaming product, it's good to look at digital. Now, we do a study, the Croner Digital Content and Technology Survey, and the appendix we have who's in it. But you'll see that in our core digital group, these are digital companies, technology companies, that they offer long-term incentives way down, and maybe if only 50%, 42% is support. but still they're offering. And same with private companies who offer stock options and the promise of, getting acquired or going public. 67% of those offer, but again, they're very, very deep. So it's a complicated world because if you're needing to compete with technology organizations to develop the next product or support the next customer, that there's a whole suite of compensation elements that may not be offered at lower levels in the media industry. So then it puts more pressure on base salary and stuff like that. So that's really important to know. And I wanted to mention that the other thing that's puts, and I think this is why you saw the connectivity providers pay more for their software engineers, that when you look at digital companies that are core digital, blue is base, gray is total cash, and green is the target value of total cash plus equity, that the digital companies just have so much more they can provide. And so if we look at cash, we're starting to catch up in the media industry. That data science is only 15% higher in general, software engineering 10. Editorial, interestingly, they're investing in that. That's paid a lot more. Producing, we're ahead. Digital isn't paying as much as the media industry as the C2HR companies are. But when it comes to being able to offer target value of equity, there's just no competing. And so the connectivity providers and the content developers need to offer other things to take care of it. So there's still a digital challenge in the world. I know that tech stock is being hit. There are layoffs, but there are still people working there and they still get stock and the stock can go up. And so it's still a viable part of the compensation package. So the current insights I want to talk to, this is about trends and other, not just compensation benchmarking and hot jobs, but what other things are we dealing with in the C2HR surveys and in compensation? And by far, you can see the gray's connectivity providers and the blue's content developers. By far, the top two issues are pay equity and pay transparency, and I'll get into that more. Inclusion and belonging is going down. Performance management has always stayed about at 50%. And then interesting, like the health insurance and compliance is varied between our participants. But pay equity and pay transparency still remain really, really important. I'm going to speak to that a little bit at the end. The other thing that is just top of mind across all of the participants is AI. And here we just have this slide because AI, we do cover in our Croner Digital Content Technology Survey, we do actually cover the AI machine learning engineer. We have for a long time, and that has for several years been a premium job. And so we're just showing you here that that even when the job works directly in AI, like the AI engineering, that is commanded a premium as people work to train or learn and create their products. And this is not new. And actually, I think our participants are closing the gap a little bit because of the need to compete for the technology talent. I will say that AI, and you have a learning series coming up on it, which sounds really, really interesting, is that where it's evolving with our C2HR participants in our planning meetings, is that it's becoming a part of many, many jobs. And so we think it's going to be defining job definitions and descriptions, and maybe certain roles will be reconfigured if AI can help or do, take something off so someone can do something else. But here we just wanted to say this was something from our data that we could show that AI continues to demand a premium, either in our head space or in our compensation space. And the other thing that, though I would say it's not a hot topic anymore, it's a culture topic. And that has to do with in-office hybrid and permanent remote. Our connectivity providers reflect many of the other, like Reflect Digital. Our connectivity providers are nationwide. And so seeing about 10 to 20% of permanent remote in gray is pretty typical of what we're seeing, and that's been pretty settled. So the idea of mostly in-office hybrid with permanent remote in our mountain region, which if you can see the sample of incumbents, which is the lowest region of all the smallest, that has the highest percent. I think that has to do with the denominator. I think if you had proportionally as high you would see on the high side of the mountain is permanent remote, but it's where the people are located. But this is I think that this continues to be a culture discussion. And as we know from the news that different segments of industries are asking people to come back in different ways, but our media segments still have the permanent remote in a certain percentage of jobs. What that's meant, and we've been trying to watch this over the years, is that we have seen we still observe geographic pay differentials, but we have generally seen a tightening of the geographic differentials across our survey. So if 0 is the average of everybody's pay level, we still have higher premiums on the West and East Coast. We still have lower geographic pay in the Southwest, Midwest, and Mountain. I'm sorry, South. Mountain has always had this unique little bump up here, maybe because it's the mountains. It looks like the mountains. But we're seeing a small reduction in the differences. Not huge, not a huge trend, but there's a little bit of tightening of differentials. Content developers are unique in that, first of all, the thing to remember is that it's primarily a West-East set of companies. So if you look at the sample in our content developers, we have 12,000 incumbents in the West that are reported and 18 in the East, and everything in between is much, much more reduced, though we have a nice representation of 5,000 in the South. But so you can see that in any of the areas where there are employees, that there's a higher percentage of permanent remote. Again, this is a question of culture, and you can also see that on the coast, there's a slightly reduced amount of permanent remote. I think people are asking folks to come into the office. South has a little bit more. Because of the strong coastal representation, we're not showing geographic differentials, but what tends to be in content developers, the unique way of keeping and paying people competitively and keeping talent is the use of employment contracts. And so we look at, because we have a blend of interesting participants, we have our media organizations, and then we have those that were originally streamers or not, or other types of organizations that aren't that have media but aren't core media. Media, about 82% of our core participants in media are using employment contracts. 18% are not, whereas only 7% of those outside of media are using them. And primarily what we're showing here is companies and using contracts and incumbents having them. Primarily they're at the top in the EVP level, some SVPs. We have 62% of our SVPs on contract, and then it drops off to VPs and very low on senior directors and directors. Employment contracts tell our top executives that we care about you. They lock them in for a certain number of years, and it's an effective retention tool and protection tool that is used by the content developer side. What we are still struggling with across our content developers and our connectivity providers is the development of the technical ladders in light of organizations that really you used to go from assistant coordinator straight into management, manager, director, VP. And now we also have side by side, we have technology jobs that you never want to go into management, and you want them to be using their technical skills. Many of our connectivity providers and content developers have introduced technical ladders and have figured out how to put this to the side, but still struggling with how to focus on, identifying how to level and focus management versus technical is a key area that our participants have been focusing on. And when that comes to their job architecture, they've had a lot of work in making sure that they describe those levels and have them available across their different functions. But this is the impact of streaming and technology on our participants, and it's quite profound. One more trend that we are seeing is that as you're anticipating from a compensation perspective, how much salaries are going to be budgeted to increase, we're seeing very flat between this year and projected for 2025. We generally do the updated salary budget survey in August. That's the earliest time of the year that you all can anticipate. You'll know your 2024 and you'll have your 2025, but you can see that it's everything is very flat, whether it's the gray connectivity providers, the blue content developers, or the general industry. And at the time that we looked at inflation, at right here, we are back to having our budgets higher than inflation, though inflation is changing. But we did have budgets that were lower than inflation that was putting a lot of pressure on pay, and now inflation is down, and we're kind of getting back to an old pattern of beating inflation a little bit. So what we've seen in terms of external drives internal. I think that we are all human nature is and program and compensation programs are like, let's do least harm and let's try to do limited change, because you have human beings on the other end of compensation and you don't want to make major changes that aren't going to attract, retain, and motivate and have people feel secure. But there are continued pressures coming in from the outside that are helping, that are pushing compensation trends, and that's why pay transparency and pay equity, I believe, were the top two issues from our participants. In the US, just this year, 5 more states are coming online with pay transparency. And then also, and you'll see sort of the north, the upper parts of our country. And then the EU, those of you who have global operations with enough employees, you have 150 employees and above, have to start to listen for and comply with an EU directive that's telling each of the countries in the EU that they have to create their own national laws about pay transparency. And all of the themes of pay transparency, I'll remind you, have to do with, you need to be transparent about what you're going to hire, and you can't ask any salary history, so it's pay for the job. And that they always provide opportunities it gives a little bit more empowerment to the employees for their right to information. Organizations have to report. And then in the EU, not so much in the US, the US has other ways, but in the EU, there are going to be fines if a reported gender pay gap exceeds 5% and cannot be justified. So a little bit more empowerment to the employees, a lot more requirements on companies. So that is changing the role of what we need to prioritize in compensation. It's really interesting. Many of you who participated are about to get our interim survey on pay transparency practices. And among the things that we discovered, this is back in the US, is that this pressure for pay transparency for those organizations that have employees in states that that have pay transparency laws and that don't, that those who are in states both with and without transparency laws, 65% of you are going to implement pay transparency practices even when it's not required, and 35% are going to stick with whatever's required. And so that's really interesting. So you all are about to, whoever's having to comply is just like, let's just do it everywhere. And so what that's done, and we've had a couple of webinars on this because we think it's important, is the work that was more, let's call it technical and advisory to leaders and managers. Our role as compensation practitioners is expanding. So A and E here are we made in green because what the compensation and total rewards have to do more upfront in developing a compensation philosophy and framework. And then our classic work, B, which was building infrastructure, job architectures and ranges, which we've always done, ensuring our competitive pay, what we've always done, testing for fairness and equity and ability to make transparent. That's all, core compensation work. But now we're also finding that the compensation needs to be the communicator, developing the communication plan, helping people communicate, giving them key phrases. So all of a sudden, the quantitative is being accompanied with the qualitative and the narrative, and compensation practitioners are having to develop skills, both in storytelling skills and even more consultative skills, which also means that we need more technology to get the back end stuff done because we have to spend more time on the green stuff now. So all these things are impacting us in our work, which is exciting for some of us and terrifying for others. And then the other thing that we will say is that we'll keep, sticking to this mantra, which is that everyone can do this. And we've either collaborated with people or we've watched our participants do this, which is that it's you start with your codifying your jobs. And this is what C2HR does for you. It gives you a roadmap of almost all the jobs that are unique to the industry. And then you take a process of making sure that you understand the jobs, you really understand the content, you make sure that you incorporate HR, you develop and you create these families that are in the grid, you map people to it. It's very systematic. You validate it, and then we can go about doing, then you can, if we said optional, our market is optional because for pay transparency and equity, you don't even have to have market data to do it. But then you have all of your codes, and then you develop your ranges, either based on your situational pay or what the market says. Then you identify your pay gaps, the math can do it, and then you determine your adjustments. But it really is to make sure that we're all compliant. It's about going back to the jobs and making sure that people are assigned to the right jobs. And C2HR surveys can do this, which is just amazing. So I have a couple of slides in the appendix, and then also we'll have the SHRM code for you. But if there are any questions, happy to take them if you put them in the chat.
Holly, I don't see any questions yet. So if people would like to put questions in the Q&A box, if you do that, we can then ask Hallie to share, to answer any questions you might have after she shared all of this information with us today. Are there any questions for Hallie? I'm going to check again. So Hallie, just giving some time if people have questions. So is AI the area where you're seeing the job structure is where there are going to be more jobs? Are there any other areas that you see trending as you've had the planning meetings and things like that this year?
We have seen a few more additions in more levels in jobs, and we have seen more infrastructure and leadership jobs. So what we're seeing, not executives, but if we used to have encoding, we're seeing encoding leaders, we're seeing more supervisors. So we're seeing more jobs that are organizing the work. Where we've seen AI is less in the engineering and more in either an AI strategist. So that's sort of where the role is to look at where it's going to play in the business. And then the discussions have been we're going to need to change our job descriptions as AI takes on part of the roles where we may be removing parts of jobs and adding new accountabilities to them. So I think those would be the trends.
Okay, and I think the questions are starting to pop up. So thank you. And here's one for AI, and then there's something else. Are you seeing the adoption of AI enhance or detract from the qualifications of the job itself?
In our discussion so far, we've learned that the AI is enhancing the ability of our of different functions to do their role. We had a presentation. I'm going to give one example, and it happens to be in compensation because we had a presentation from compensation and an HR practitioner that many of the core questions in they created a chat bot that will answer key policy questions from the handbook as well as some of the core questions that come to HR so that that level of answers is taken care of so that they're getting to the next level. So what we're seeing then is that the time taken on the repetitive work is being reduced, allowing, again, to do more of the either managing or communicating and connecting and consulting. So that's just an example. So what we're seeing is we're seeing a change at the baseline work, an opportunity, and then an opportunity to focus on some of the stuff that we can never get to.
Well, then here's one more. Are you seeing more companies switching to a national pay scale versus a regional one?
Wonderful question. Thank you for that. We are not. So for those that had geographic differentials before COVID, they've maintained them. We continue to see geographic pay differentials. And the place that we've seen the national rate has likely been in the for the remote in the middle of the country, and that's only if the remote is in a place that's not really even much lower than the national rate. But we don't see that very often anymore. We are seeing more geozones and the use of geozones to ensure equitable pay and pay that's comparably equitable in the places that they live.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay.
Okay, I
No,
will.
I don't see it. People are just thanking you for your
Wow,
time and
thank you.
sharing
Thank
insight
you.
today.
Thank you for being here. I wish I could see you all. I was going to flip to the SHRM code. I have my appendix, but that's there. But is that fine to show the SHRM code
Yeah,
here?
it is. It
Great.
is, most definitely. Well, we want to thank you, Hali, for sharing your insight, of course, for being a partner and, conducting the compensation survey and sharing the information. And know the survey will be launching again soon for this year. And I want to thank everyone in the community for taking the time for the call. And we will send an email with this recording and the presentation later on this week. So thank you, everyone, and hope everyone has a great day.
Bye. Thank you.